It was a small, sleepy town in upstate New York, known for its quiet streets and friendly faces. The kind of place where neighbors still waved at each other, where kids ran down the roads with Easter baskets in hand, hunting for eggs on that bright spring morning. But that particular Easter, in 1975, something was different. Something that would forever change the town of Millbrook. Lydia Bennett had always loved Easter. It was a time for family gatherings, sweet treats, and the fresh promise of spring. As a young girl, she'd spent countless holidays running through the fields behind her family's farmhouse, picking wildflowers and listening to her mother's laughter. But on the evening of Easter Sunday, something sinister had begun to take root. Lydia's brother, Jason, was about to come home from college, and her parents had been busy all day preparing for his arrival. But Lydia was alone, watching the twilight settle over the land when she first heard the noise. It was a soft tapping at the back door. Curious but cautious, Lydia stood from the kitchen table where she'd been eating her Easter dinner alone and walked toward the door. She peered through the glass window at the back of the house, but there was no one there. The darkness outside stretched far beyond the small circle of light cast by the porch lamp. Nothing stirred. She shook her head, telling herself it was just the wind. It was a cold, windy night, after all, with the air still thick from a heavy afternoon rainstorm. But just as she turned to head back to the kitchen, she heard it again. The tapping was louder this time, more persistent. Something, or someone, was definitely outside. Her heart began to race. She moved cautiously to the door, unlocking the bolt. As soon as she opened it, a gust of cold air hit her face, making her shiver. But there was no one there. Just the empty yard bathed in the soft light of the street lamp in the distance. "Jason?" Lydia called, expecting her brother. "Is that you?" But there was no answer. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring into the darkness, her pulse pounding in her ears. Something felt wrong. Something was off. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw a figure move in the shadows. It was a man, or what looked like a man. But his movements were jerky, unnatural, as if he was struggling to keep his balance or was being pulled by invisible strings. Lydia's breath caught in her throat. The figure was getting closer, and as it stepped into the dim light, Lydia saw something that made her blood run cold. The man's face was a mask of horror. His skin was stretched tight across his skull, his eyes wide and unblinking, and his lips drawn back in an expression of pain. But it wasn't just his face that terrified her. It was his hands. His fingers were bent at odd angles, twisted unnaturally, as if they'd been broken and reset in the wrong direction. Without thinking, Lydia slammed the door shut and locked it. Her heart pounded as she backed away from the door, terrified and unable to move. She didn't know who the man was, but she was certain that he was no ordinary person. She heard the man's voice then, or rather, what could barely be called a voice. It was rasping, barely a whisper, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Help me," he groaned, "help me, or they'll take you too." Lydia ran to the phone, but as her fingers fumbled over the receiver, she felt a cold presence behind her. Slowly, she turned around, her body frozen in terror. The man was standing in her living room now, his twisted hands reaching for her, his eyes locked onto hers. And in that instant, Lydia knew he wasn't human. Whatever he was, It had been waiting for her, waiting for someone in this house. On this night, she screamed and ran out of the front door, the sound of her brother's name still ringing in her ears. But as she reached the road, she saw something that made her heart stop. The entire street was empty. No lights, no people. The houses, which had once seemed so full of life, now stood dark and silent. Her brother's car was parked at the end of the driveway, the headlights still on, but there was no sign of him. And then, in the distance, Lydia heard something. A faint cry, not Jason's voice, but something else. A chilling, high-pitched wail that seemed to be coming from all directions. It was the kind of sound that gnawed at your sanity, like the last breath of a dying animal or a soul lost in torment. The air grew heavier, colder, and Lydia could feel the presence closing in around her. It was like being trapped in a nightmare. But she couldn't wake up. The wail grew louder and louder, until it was almost deafening. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift and move, and for a split second, Lydia thought she could see shapes moving in the corners of her vision. She turned and ran, faster than she ever thought possible. The darkness chased her. She didn't dare look back, afraid of what she might see. But in the distance, through the trees, she thought she caught a glimpse of something, a pale, distorted face. The same face she had seen at the door earlier, watching her from the shadows. By the time Lydia reached the town center, the sun was just beginning to rise. The wail had stopped. The town, once so peaceful and familiar, was now empty. She stumbled into the diner, breathless and terrified, and told the manager what had happened. But he didn't seem surprised. "The Easter curse," he muttered, shaking his head. "It happens every year. Some people are chosen, and some never make it out." Lydia looked at him, confused, as he explained the grim truth. The town of Millbrook had been founded on dark rituals. The people here had been practicing forbidden rites for generations, sacrificing one person each year to ensure the survival of the community. And for some, it was too late to escape. Jason's body was found 3 days later, deep in the woods, twisted and unrecognizable. But Lydia never returned to Millbrook. She left, leaving behind the home she had known, the memories, and everything she had loved. To this day, people say that the curse of Millbrook still lingers. Every Easter, they hear the whispers in the wind, the sounds of twisted footsteps in the night, and the faint wail of something lost. Some say the town is still waiting for its next victim. But Lydia knows better. She knows that the town's curse is no ordinary one. It's an ancient evil, passed down through the years, and it's never truly gone. It just waits. And every Easter, it comes closer. In the small town of Ashton, Pennsylvania, Easter had always been a day of joy, family, and tradition. The town's annual Easter egg hunt was a beloved event, drawing families from miles away. Children, parents, and grandparents gathered at Ashton Park each year for what seemed like an innocent and festive occasion. But in 1983, something went terribly wrong. And what was once a cherished tradition became the beginning of an unimaginable nightmare. It started with the arrival of the McCullough family, a seemingly normal, well-off family from the city. They had recently moved to Ashton, seeking a quieter life, far away from the hustle and bustle of urban living. The McCulloughs had 2 young children, Emma and Jacob. who were excited to join the Easter egg hunt for the first time. They had heard so much about it from their new friends at school. The morning of the hunt was sunny and crisp. Emma, a bright and energetic 8-year-old, was especially excited. She had always loved Easter, with the candy, the eggs, and the promise of fun. Her little brother Jacob was only 5, but he was just as eager. The park was already filled with families when they arrived. Colorful ribbons hung from the trees, and the smell of fresh spring flowers filled the air. The hunt was about to begin. As the horn sounded, signaling the start of the event, the children rushed toward the designated area where the eggs were scattered across the park. Emma and Jacob sprinted ahead, their laughter ringing through the air as they collected the brightly colored eggs hidden in the grass. The other children were just as excited, their baskets filling up with treats and trinkets as they raced to find more. But in the midst of the chaos, Emma noticed something strange. One of the eggs, a large, shiny red one, was not like the others. It was tucked away in the far corner of the park, beneath an old oak tree. It was placed carefully in the grass, as if someone had made sure it was hidden just out of reach. The other children seemed to overlook it, focused on the easier-to-find eggs scattered nearby. Curiosity piqued, Emma made her way toward the red egg. She bent down to pick it up, her fingers brushing the smooth surface. It felt unusually cold, almost unnaturally so, but she didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just the weather, she reasoned. But as soon as she held the egg in her hand, she felt a shiver run down her spine. It was then that she heard the voice. "Take it," the voice whispered. Emma looked around, but there was no one nearby. The park was crowded with children and parents, but she saw no one who could have spoken to her. She shook it off, thinking it was just her imagination. "Take it," the voice repeated, this time louder, more insistent. Emma's heart began to race. She turned the egg over in her hands, and that's when she saw it. On the back of the egg was a symbol, a strange twisted mark that resembled an old faded rune. She didn't recognize it, but there was something unsettling about it, like a dark warning. Suddenly, she heard her mother calling her name from across the park. The sound of her voice snapped Emma out of her trance. She looked down at the egg one last time, her fingers still clutching it tightly, before she tucked it into her basket and ran to join her family. But as she walked away, she felt an unsettling sense of dread. The voice was gone, but the weight of the egg in her basket felt heavier with each step. That night, after the Easter festivities had ended, Emma and Jacob were in bed, eagerly counting the candy they had collected throughout the day. But Emma couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled over her. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the red egg she had placed on the nightstand. The strange symbol on it seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. She reached out to touch it again, and as soon as her fingers made contact, the room seemed to grow colder. The lights flickered, and the shadows in the corners of the room grew darker, deeper. Emma pulled her hand back, but the strange sensation didn't go away. It was as if something was watching her. A sudden knock at the door made her jump. "Emma, honey, are you okay?" Her mother's voice called from the hallway. Emma quickly stood up and opened the door. Her mother was standing there, her face pale, her eyes wide with concern. "Honey, are you feeling all right?" her mother asked again, her voice trembling. "I just heard something." Something I can't explain. Emma's heart raced. What do you mean, Mom? Her mother hesitated, then whispered, I heard whispers. In the house. And I felt cold. Like someone was in here with you. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She had felt it too. That cold presence. The same feeling she had experienced earlier with the egg. But before she could say anything, she heard it again. A faint whisper, coming from the direction of her nightstand. Her mother's eyes widened in fear. What is that? Emma turned to look at the red egg. It was now rolling slowly across the nightstand, moving as if being pushed by an unseen force. Her heart pounded in her chest as the egg stopped, facing them both. Suddenly the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. The voice that had spoken to Emma in the park returned. But this time, it was much stronger. It wasn't just a voice. It was a presence, a force that filled the room with malice. Take it, the voice demanded. It's yours now. Emma screamed, but the sound was lost in the whirlwind of terror that erupted around her. The walls seemed to close in, the air thickening with an oppressive weight. Her mother grabbed her and tried to pull her away from the egg. But it was too late. The shadows in the room grew longer, and Emma could feel herself being pulled toward the egg. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. The egg stopped moving, and the room returned to its normal state. But Emma and her mother knew something had changed. The next morning, when they tried to leave the house, they found the doors locked, the windows sealed shut. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't escape. It was as if the house itself had become a prison. Weeks passed, and the McCullough family's once bright future in Ashton turned dark. Strange occurrences began happening in the town. People disappeared without a trace. Animals were found mutilated in the woods. And the whispers, always the whispers, grew louder. The McCulloughs never left that house. And eventually, the town forgot about them. But every Easter, when the egg hunt came around, there was always one child who would disappear, one family who would lose everything. And somewhere, hidden in the grass of Ashton Park, there was always a red egg waiting to be found. It was the spring of 1969 when the town of Green Hollow, West Virginia, faced a tragedy unlike any they had ever experienced. The town was small, tucked away in the Appalachian foothills, surrounded by thick forests and steep mountains. Every Easter, the people of Green Hollow would gather in the old cemetery on the outskirts of town for a community picnic, where they would celebrate the season with family, food, and fellowship. The cemetery, despite its age and the eerie quiet it always seemed to hold, was a place where the town's ancestors rested peacefully. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. But on Easter Sunday of that year, the town's peaceful existence would be shattered forever. The Murphy family had lived in Green Hollow for generations. The patriarch, Thomas Murphy, was the town's undertaker, known for his quiet demeanor and strong work ethic. He had a small funeral home right next to the cemetery, and he made sure the graves were always well tended. His wife, Margaret, was a kind woman who baked the best pies in the town. Their children, Elizabeth and James, were well loved by the other children in the community. They were good people, and their family was deeply intertwined with the traditions of Green Hollow. That Easter, however, something was different. Elizabeth Murphy, who was in her early 20s, had been feeling uneasy for weeks leading up to the holiday. She couldn't explain why, but she had an overwhelming sense that something terrible was about to happen. Her nightmares had become more frequent, and she would often wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, hearing whispers in the dark. The whispers were always the same. You are next. But it wasn't just her. James, her younger brother, had been acting strangely too. He would wander around the house at night, staring at the windows as though waiting for something or someone. Their parents dismissed it as stress from the busy season. After all, Easter was the busiest time of year for Thomas, who had to prepare multiple burials for the coming weeks. But for Elizabeth, the feeling of dread only grew stronger. The day of the Easter picnic, the entire town gathered at the cemetery, enjoying the beautiful weather and the warmth of the sun. The air was filled with the sweet smell of blooming flowers and fresh grass, and children played around the gravestones, hunting for Easter eggs hidden among the tombs. It was an innocent tradition, a way for the community to come together and celebrate the season of renewal. But as the day wore on, Elizabeth's unease only intensified. She found herself standing near the old stone mausoleum at the back of the cemetery, staring at the large iron gates that seemed to loom over her like a dark sentinel. Something about the mausoleum had always unsettled her. It was old, ancient even, and there were rumors that it held the remains of a cursed family, the Blackwells, a name that sent chills down the spines of everyone in Green Hollow. They had been a wealthy family, but their legacy was marred by scandal and tragedy. The Blackwells had mysteriously disappeared many years ago, their wealth and power leaving behind only whispers of dark deeds. Elizabeth had heard the stories growing up, but she never paid much attention to them. Now, standing near the mausoleum, she felt an icy chill run down her spine. It was as though the very air around her had grown heavier, thicker with a sense of malevolence. Suddenly, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She spun around, her heart leaping in her chest, only to find James standing behind her. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Elizabeth, we need to leave. Now," he said in a trembling voice. Before she could respond, there was a loud, unnatural sound. A grinding, screeching noise like metal on metal. The gates of the mausoleum began to move. Slowly at first, but then faster, as if some invisible force was pushing them open. The air grew colder, and a thick fog began to roll in, swirling around them like a living thing. Elizabeth grabbed James's arm, her mind racing. "What is happening?" James didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the mausoleum, his body frozen in fear. Something was coming out of it. Something that shouldn't be. The fog parted, just enough for them to see a figure emerging from the mausoleum. A tall, gaunt man, dressed in tattered clothes that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. His skin was deathly pale, almost as though it had been drained of all color. His eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to swallow the light around him. The figure stepped forward, his movements jerky and unnatural, as though he was being controlled by an unseen force. Elizabeth wanted to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. The figure began to speak, his voice low and rasping, like the sound of dead leaves being crushed underfoot. "You shouldn't have come," the figure croaked. "The curse of the Blackwells cannot be undone." James backed away, pulling Elizabeth with him, but the figure's gaze never wavered. He reached out a bony hand, and as he did, The ground beneath them seemed to tremble. The fog thickened, wrapping around them, blocking out the rest of the world. The sounds of the town, the laughter, the chatter, the children's cries, faded away, leaving only the chilling presence of the figure before them. Elizabeth could feel the cold creeping into her bones, numbing her, making it hard to breathe. The figure took another step forward, his mouth twitching as if he was smiling, though his face remained as blank as death. "Your family has been marked," he said, his voice sending a wave of panic through Elizabeth's chest. "The Blackwell bloodline never leaves. It always claims what is its own." James pulled Elizabeth away, his grip tightening on her arm. "We have to go. Now." But as they turned to run, they found that the path back to the picnic was blocked. The fog had surrounded them, and all they could see was the tall figure, his outstretched arm reaching for them. The last thing Elizabeth heard before everything went black was a loud, unholy scream. A scream that seemed to come from everywhere at once. A scream that echoed through the hills of Green Hollow, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. When they found the bodies of Elizabeth and James a week later, the townspeople said they were unrecognizable. Their skin was gray and shriveled, their faces twisted in expressions of absolute terror. But it was the eyes that haunted those who saw them. Empty, hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through you, as if whatever had taken them had stolen their souls. The cemetery was sealed off, and the Easter picnic tradition was never held again. But some say that every year, on Easter Sunday, the fog rolls into Green Hollow once more, and the shadow of the Blackwell curse claims another victim. And somewhere, in the distance, you can still hear the faint whispers of Elizabeth and James calling for help from beyond the grave.